So Capcom recently just put out the results of a worldwide survey, and it seems that many fans want to see a reboot or remake of older IPs. And while not placing first on the list, a lot of people want to see Mega Man. Over the past few years, I've been trying this out and remaking other games in 3D, so I wanted to try and tackle Mega Man next. Normally I wait until the end of a project and make one video, but I wanted to test out a series of shorter videos leading up to one big video at the end, so you'll have to let me know if you guys like this new format. And with that said, let's get started. So the first thing I wanted to do was make Mega Man into a 3D model and get him moving around. I found a sprite sheet with all his basic animations and decided to get started with just these poses for now. I'll save the other poses like the hurt and stun for when I start adding in the enemies, and the throwing animation will be saved until I add in the power-ups. Starting with the idle pose, I had to edit it a bit so that he would be facing forward instead of positioned to one side. I had to center his head and make it so that his eyes would be facing forward. There are also a few points on his lower body to change to make it symmetrical. In trying to replicate how this light blue part looked on his helmet, I ended up making this weird helipad landing shape, but as you'll see later, I eventually got rid of it and just made it all one color. After finishing the 2D version, it was time to import it into Magic Voxel. From there, I decided to get rid of the black outline, as I would be adding that back in later when I put him into Unity. I decided to work on the head first since it was an easy shape to work with, so I got rid of the body for now. I duplicated the head and rotated it to use as a reference. I could then stretch out the head in both directions, and using the reference, I could cut off anything else that I didn't need. It obviously still looked a bit weird, so there was a bit more editing that needed to be done. I used this pose as a reference for the side of his helmet, and cut out a similar shape for the light blue part where his ears would be. Then I tried to bring his face forward to make it look normal, and fix the back of his helmet. With the head finished, I then had to work on the body. I did a similar thing here using the torso as a reference before stretching him out. In order to add the detail, I then used my own body as a reference to try and visualize what each pose should look like. I posed myself in similar ways to get an idea of what the details should look like. Then I just went around cutting off the corners to make the transitions between different areas look smoother. I generally worked on one side so that I could copy it and flip it to replace the other side, and I ended up doing that a few times. After finishing, I put the head back on and I was pretty satisfied with the result. Now, I could just put him in Unity like this, but it would look a bit strange like some sort of broken T-pose animation, so next I had to make the other poses to make his run cycle. Normally with 3D models you would set up bones and animate the bones of the character to make a run cycle. However, with the approach I'm taking, I have to make separate voxel models for each new pose. It's more work, but I think the end result has always looked really cool in my other projects. Whenever Mega Man moves, he has this inch pose that he goes into in between his idle and running animations. It's pretty much exactly the same as his idle pose, but his front leg is shifted back 1 pixel. So this was simple enough to make. I just took everything above his feet and shifted it back 1 block. The running animation was a lot more involved though. Since the pose is so different from his idle pose, I decided to just start it from scratch. I tried to smooth out the area where his head was, to make it easier to design the part of his body hidden behind his head. I decided to use the full body idle pose as a reference for the running pose. It helped me get a general shape for what it should look like, and then I could go back and make it so that there would only be 1 arm and 1 leg on each side of the body. Then from there, it's pretty much just more of the same, rounding off corners and moving things around to make it look more natural. Now I could take this completed model, flip it around, and it looks like a basic walk cycle. The only problem is that there's 1 more in-between frame for the run animation. Some of the other games I've worked on just reuse their idle pose as the in-between, but Mega Man actually uses another new pose. The process for making this pose was exactly the same as making the first running pose, so there isn't much to talk about there. If you do want to see these full time lapses though, I started uploading them for my channel members, so you can join for that and other behind the scenes updates by clicking the join button. And with that, I now have all the poses I need to get him moving around in Unity. I made a new project and basically just copied and pasted the character controller and camera controller from my last project since I liked the way that they worked. I reused the same script and changed a few things to swap between the different models when he starts running. Oh, and I also spent like 2 seconds recoloring his face so that it looks like his eyes are closed to make the blink animation. And now I can add in the outline script to get back the black outline around the character. It's starting to look pretty good now, but jumping looks pretty weird, so I'm gonna do something about that. For the jump pose, I stretched out the torso to make it the same width as the idle pose. Then I made the arms and legs a bit smaller on each side, and moved around different parts of his leg to make it look like they weren't just dangling straight down. He also gets this weird mouth shape, so I had to add that in as well. And now Mega Man can run and jump. Now there are just 2 more basic movement mechanics left to create, the climbing and the shooting. I'll start with the climbing. The climbing pose is very similar to the jumping pose, so it wasn't too hard to create that one. I even ended up using the jumping pose as a reference for this one. Then I just flipped it around to make the other side. The other pose was a lot harder to make though. His head is facing down, and you can tell from the way that his body is positioned that he's leaning forward. So I had to imagine what that pose would look like from the side. The lower half of his body is similar to the jumping pose, so I reused that and made a few changes here and there. But for the upper half, I had to reconstruct it from scratch. I gradually made it so that the upper body was leaning forward because this pose is used when Mega Man is climbing up the top of the ladder onto the platform. So I'm trying to make it look like his upper body is leaning on top of the platform. I then tried to use the regular head that I've been using and rotate it a bunch of different ways, but it kept end up looking awkward. So instead I decided to just remake the head in a new way, starting with this little bit that you can see from the top here. Then I worked my way down and spent a lot of time trying to figure out ways to make the face look normal. You won't even really see the face in regular gameplay since it's facing down to the ground, but the way it looked still bothered me. In the end, this was as good as I could get it. With the models finished, the tricky part will now be implementing the climbing mechanic in Unity. I made a quick model for the ladder and made another version to represent the top. I made a couple of test ladders facing different directions to make sure it works in every direction, and started to program this mechanic. The best way that I could think to do this was with raycasts. First, Mega Man looks out in front of him to see if there's a ladder. If he's moving in the direction of the ladder when it's really close, he turns off his regular movement script and replaces it with the ladder movement script. Now pressing W makes him move up, and pressing S makes him move down. There's another raycast that's aimed at the area below his feet to check if he's back on the ground again. If the raycast detects the ground, he detaches from the ladder and goes back to his regular movement script. And finally, we need to tell when he's at the top of the ladder. There's one raycast that's aimed forward from around chest level. Once it stops detecting the ladder, he moves into the second climbing post for the top of the ladder. There is then a second raycast near his feet. If he keeps moving up and that one stops detecting the ladder, it then knows to start moving him forward as he tap dances through the air. The ground raycast will then detect when the ground is below him and put the regular movement back on. Now Mega Man can climb up and down any ladder, and it's time to move on to the final mechanic, which is using his Mega Buster. I basically just had to model it once, and then I could copy and paste it onto every other animation pose. There were a few changes I had to make on each individual model to make sure the arm looked natural, but it was generally an easy thing to make. I was trying to figure out how the Mega Buster worked, since it seemed like there was a limit on how often you could fire. They always seemed to shoot in triplets, unless you were near a wall. At first I thought there was some sort of cooldown in between shots, but I eventually realized that there was actually a limit on how many projectiles could be on screen at once, and there was always a limit of 3 projectiles. As soon as the third projectile left the screen, you could fire another one, but never before. The camera on my version can see a much wider area, so limiting it to 3 shots on screen doesn't really make much sense. Instead I decided to make it despawn after about a second. I figured this because going frame by frame, it took about 27 frames to go from here to off screen at 30 FPS. So I figured a projectile would probably last on screen for a full 30 frames, or 1 second. I then tried to figure out how far it traveled to determine the speed, so I made this diagram to have a reference. It looks like it travels the length of about 11 Mega Mans in 1 second. So I placed 11 Mega Mans side by side and tried out different speeds until I could reach the end in 1 second before despawning. This is also how I determined how high Mega Man should jump. And now he can shoot as many projectiles as he wants. I also chose a new spawn point for the bullets when he jumps, and when he's facing left or right on the ladder. And finally he can shoot in every direction. I also spent some time experimenting with other camera angles, like an over-the-shoulder third person, to center his fire on the center of the screen. And I also thought about trying out a first-person perspective like Metroid Prime. But from looking at how the levels are designed from left to right, I might actually go for a camera similar to Crash Bandicoot, where it follows the player from behind as he traverses through the level. But I'll have to save that for another video, since that's everything I've finished so far. Alright, see ya.